Good afternoon. My name is Maria Arruda, and I'm here with you today to chair this panel discussion that is the first session of a three-part series called Is a University Colonial? Critical Conversations on its Past, Present, and Future. I am here in my capacity as chair of the Black and Asian Minority Ethnic Network. And during this session today, which is the first one, that will focus on the past, considering and debating the historic role of a university in cultivating inequalities. We are going to be to listen to the views of three experts. But before that, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Frank Tuitt. He's the vice president, my apologies, for diversity and inclusion of the University of Connecticut. That's going to delight us with his opening remarks. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you, Maria. Can you hear me? Great, great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank Tuitt, and as Maria said, I'm the Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer and Professor of Higher Education at the University of Connecticut. And it is my pleasure to provide some opening remarks for this important conversation entitled, Is the University Colonial? Critical Conversations on its Past, Present, and Future. This conversation is important to me on a variety of levels. First, in my role as the university's Senior Diversity Officer, I have the privilege of working with my colleagues in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and throughout the institution to help advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. Another reason this conversation is important to me is that as a Black man, born in Hackney, London, to Caribbean parents, but raised and educated in the United States of America, arguably colonialism has been a part of my life way before I ever took my first breath. Taken together, my professional personal experiences have left me searching for answers on how post-secondary institutions around the world can create educational environments that respect and care for the souls of students who were not a part of their plans when these institutions were initially created. Earlier this year, a colleague of mine, Dr. Saran Stewart, and I had the opportunity to write a book chapter entitled Decolonizing Academic Spaces, Moving Beyond Diversity to Promote Racial Equity in Post-Secondary Education. In the chapter, we argued that in spite of increased efforts of higher education institutions around the globe to be responsive to the increasing diversity of students arriving on campus, they have not been successful in creating inclusive, equitable campus environments that allow BIPOC students to be the best versions of themselves. In this chapter, we point to reports coming out of Canada, Europe, and the United States that provide accounts of the extensive amounts of investment in diversity. However, they have showed mixed results. And this has been something that's plagued me for a while. I've been engaged in diversity, equity, inclusion efforts for about 15 years as an academic. And after these many years to work in advanced diversity, I've come to the realization that focusing just on diversity alone will not make our institutions inclusive and equitable. Unfortunately, despite best efforts to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, post-secondary institutions around the world, including my own here at the University of Connecticut, have found themselves in the midst of campus protests where BIPOC students and their allies have been speaking out in resistance to their daily encounters with microaggressions, micro-invalidations, and other not so subtle acts of discrimination, demanding for decolonization in higher education. In the conclusion of that chapter, we make the claim that the surge in campus rebellions, the surge in efforts to make Black Lives Matter occurring around the world are in part a result of the failure of academic institutions to move beyond superficial commitments to diversity, which by its design and limitations never really had a chance to facilitate equity and inclusion for racially minoritized communities. Specifically, we attribute this failure to the reluctance of higher ed institutions, in spite of their investments in diversity, equity, and inclusion, to radically transform their systems and structures, We haven't done a great job in doing that. And by result, we've left intact the vestiges of coloniality that continue to marginalize minoritized communities. So it may not be a surprise to you that my answer to the question, is the university colonial, is yes, absolutely. I would like to thank my colleagues here at the University of Nottingham and the University of Connecticut for creating the space for this timely discussion. My hope is that those of you who are here with us today will come away with an enhanced understanding of how academic spaces within your spheres of influence can be decolonized in a manner that facilitates movement beyond diversity to racial equity and to inclusion. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing the conversation.
Frank, thank you so much for your very insightful opening remarks. They set the scene so well for what we've got to come. So it is my pleasure to invite one of your colleagues at the University of Connecticut, Professor Lewis Gordon, professor and head at the Department of Philosophy of the university, to give his overviews about this theme. Thank you very much, Lewis.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thank you, Dr. Tuitt, and also my colleagues here. It's wonderful to see you, Cecile Wright, Sandy Grande, and also Sarah Sharples. Before I begin, we're in very difficult times, and it's crucial for me simply first to just speak out to all of you out there. We know there's not only the spiking COVID-19 situation, but the fact that there is disruption all over the globe in the forms of fascism, the radicalization of attacks on indigenous communities across South America and North America, and also the South Pacific. And the list goes on, as we see in terms of also the treatment of people of African descent. And a lot of these are connected to our theme of today, because we're seeing the convergence of these, 500 years of assault on humanity coming to roost on all of us right now. And in the midst of it, it could lead to us forgetting our humanity. Remembering our humanity is also remembering the fact that many of us have lost loved ones this year. And so to all of you, I send my condolence, because what you've lost is what's irreplaceable. I also begin with Halito. I'm in the United States. I like to begin with saying hello in an indigenous language here. That's Choctaw. And I also add Hotep, which is a very ancient Meta word for peace. It's interesting that we say hello in the form of peace in so many languages, shalom in Hebrew, but also in Swahili, we mix it together with ujambo. That's not with peace, but the point is that it's very important for us also to reach out to each other if we're going to deal with issues of decolonization. And even though we may not speak each other's languages perfectly, there's something to be said in the respect offered by an effort to say something as simple as hello. Now, the question of the university, the first thing is I'm going to just give a few short remarks so we could get the conversation going. One of the things we should remember about colonization is that colonization is fundamentally an act of negative views of power. In other words, it's the use of power to disempower others. So when you're colonized, you're disempowered. Now, I bring this up mainly because there are people who look at power as a zero-sum gain. So for them, if they acquire power, it means someone else has to lose it. And that's a false dilemma. If we have a different view of how to be custodians of our planet, of each other, of how to work together, then we realize, as they say, particularly in the Bantu-speaking languages, for instance, Ubuntu, the idea is the very notion that I am is because we are. So there's a way of understanding that in order to empower myself, I should work for the empowerment of others. So if we understand that basic insight, we could understand that if we're talking about the university being colonial. We're talking about the organization of knowledge for the sake of disempowering others. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I want to make a distinction between certification and education, because there are institutions that can empower certain people with certification, but structurally disempower them by not making certification and education meet. And this is one of the reasons why today we're in such a pickle, because a lot of the globe right now has well-certified people who are agents of disempowerment. Their goal is fundamentally, in fact, anti-education. And when we're dealing with issues such as fascism, the goal, one of the biggest fears of fascism, is an actual educated citizenry. So I bring that up to point out that our critique of the university as colonial is not an anti-intellectual or anti-education position. We're arguing against the coloniality of the university because we want education. We want to have an environment in which there is the empowerment of citizenship towards democratic aims. So in terms of the past, a very simple thing. The first thing to point out is that we say university, and university similarly, you hear the word uni in it. It means one, it means whole. But the thing about it, to have this singular voice notion of university, is that it already distorts the picture, because this is a model that's connected to a particular way of looking at the world out of not only monotheism, but also out of a particular point in the history of a form of Christian imperialism. That's why many people think of universities in terms of what's inherited from Bologna, for instance, or the medieval Christian scholastic universities. And what happens there, and this is part of the coloniality of knowledge, is that it makes us imagine that thinking the organization of learning communities began when a small group of people in Europe decided to do this. Even though for thousands of years on the African continent, in Asia, and also in the Americas, people have organized learning communities precisely because when human communities become sufficiently large and complex, we need to understand what we're doing and figure out different ways of living together. And that's why we need to move to a different model than the one that was imposed, with the idea of a singular imperial voice that excludes others. I like, for instance, the Greek concept of panepistemoi, which simply means pan-knowledges, communities of knowledge coming together. But it's not only there. There are examples from ancient India. There are examples from ancient Kemet, which you all know as Egypt, in which communities would get together and they saw education as trying to find ways not only to bring the accumulation of scientific knowledge, but they also saw the question of trying to develop a way to relate to each other as a community, ethically and politically. This is one of the reasons why historically there were scientists and priests and philosophers and different groups of people who were studying toward knowledge. However, what has happened in the imperial period, particularly let's just say Euromodernity from the 15th century onward, the idea was to subordinate knowledge to other interests. So although the earlier version was about God, once the God became money, the market, exploitation of others, what began to happen has been the slow pushing to the side of the theological faculties, pushing to the side of the humanistic faculties. And you could always spot where there's an investment in power according to what functions as the center of those institutions. And so in the old universities, it was the seminary. But then in the arts and sciences, it became the lab, the scientists. But then, as we know, in the world of business, increasingly, the new seminary is the business school. And increasingly, that tells you that we have become colonized by the very idea of the market subordination of knowledge. Today, people think less about knowledge of the market and more about the market of knowledge. There are people who tend to think less about the politics of the market and more about the market of politics. And this form of market colonization linked to the other forms and what comes with them has been the constellation of stuff such as racism, sexism, homophobia, but also a fundamental attitude towards life itself, that life that is not exploitable isn't worth your time. We need to get to the idea of a different conception when we think about that and decolonizing the university. And I'll say more later, but those are my introductory remarks for us to frame the question of what we mean by the university as colonial. We should understand that it's an institution created by human beings, which means it requires our creativity to build one that actually fits the unique problems of our times, which is now the 21st century.
Wow. And after this introduction, that I'm sure it's a lot of food for thought, more than I can process. So I'll be working hard during this session today. I'm going to call my dear colleague, Professor Cecile Wright, professor at the School of Sociology and Social Policy here at the University of Nottingham.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this distinguished panel. I am your local representative, so I just hope I can do this side of the Atlantic proudly. In response to the question, is the university colonial? Well, the response is yes. And here are a few pointers in terms of my opening remark about why it is. The so-called colonial era from the 17th to the 20th centuries involved much more than the occupation of land, theft of resources, and enslavement of peoples. It also involved the destruction of local cultures in the colonies. Indigenous peoples were subjected to colonial conquest. The purpose of this being to impose the values, beliefs, and knowledge systems of the colonial powers. For example, the dominant language of Central and South America is Spanish, and the main religion, Christianity. The value and belief systems of the other, i.e. the colonized, are seen as a threat to be removed. These values, cultures, and belief systems of the colonized are depicted as inferior. The people adhering to them are depicted as inferior. It is not just their bodies that are to be trained for the use, but their thought process to be trained for the use, but their thought processes and the knowledge eradicated. So here we see that part of the agenda, part of the colonial process was the pernicious cultural genocide. All the institutions of the colonizing powers were brought into service in this conquest. In the case of this side of the Atlantic, the UK, it was the Church of England, the media, science, the law, and of course, educational institutions such as universities. It is from these institutions that Western knowledge was used to embed the superiority of the colonizers' values and justification for colonial development. In this sense, universities, even today, are colonial. The modern university's foundations are built on racism and imperialism. The academic disciplines in the modern university were related to the expansion of the empire. For example, universities provided the scientific justification for the dispossession and exploitation of lesser humans via eugenics, social Darwinian theories, and so forth. Universities became the site for the perpetuation of racial hierarchy associated with the Eurocentric culture of domination. In terms of racism, universities, as we would say in the UK, are no less racist than other organisations, and in the UK there is an ongoing debate along the lines of the police being institutionally racist, and some would argue, and so are universities. Although clearly universities at this side of the Atlantic, we would dearly ask for greater representation of Black citizens employed in those institutions. However, having said that, by having more Black representation, having more Black faces doesn't really solve the problem. Universities in ex-colonies such as Africa and the Caribbean act as conduits for the presumed superiority of Western science and the inferiority of local knowledge systems. The promotion of decolonizing the curriculum is becoming accepted by the power structure. It is accepted because they can dilute any radical politics associated with it. The academy can absorb the teaching of cultures, non-Eurocentric knowledge, without it being or having an impact on established knowledge. It can absorb this without threatening its power structure and production of knowledge, of acceptance to its founder, the state. Absorption of decolonizing the curriculum can occur without challenging the taken for granted assumption about what the world is. So my passing question is, or statement is this: these actions, decolonization of curriculum, perhaps more Black faces, do not exhaust universities' responsibilities for past injustices. Thank you.
Cecile, thank you so much. Very, very challenging and truthful statements and facts, and making us ready for this very interesting reflection that we're going to have during this afternoon. And now, last but not least, I will invite Professor Sandy Grande, professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Connecticut. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you to everybody else. I appreciate all of your words. Good afternoon, good evening over there. Ayanshu, buenas tardes, Tuite Sandy Grande, coming at you from Sakyag and Wangak territory in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm just going to join the chorus of my colleagues and say, yes, of course, the university is both colonial and colonialist. I think that's an important understanding or it's important for us to understand the implications of that. I think primarily in terms of interventions, that I think if the university is colonialist, then the intervention has to be shaped by a decolonial politics, which is very different from a social justice politics of inclusion and equity. My comments are going to be specific to the university as it emerged in the United States, particularly at institutions like my own right now, which is historically a land grant institution. And so, again, going to get into a bit more of the particularities now that the kind of global picture, I think, has been masterfully laid by my colleagues. So I appreciate that. So I'll just begin. As an arm of the settler state, the university has functioned as a site of dispossession and ideological transit, a handmaiden to the civilizing project enacted at the time of its founding. At stake was not only the promise that indigenous souls signified for the church, but also the bounty that their minds and bodies provided to the state. The forces were co-constitutive and served to mark the relationship between brutal forms of state-sanctioned violence and the eliminatory logics of the emergent so-called democracy. As noted by Patrick Wolf, while the logics of elimination include the summary liquidation of indigenous peoples, it's also enacted through native citizenship, child abduction, religious conversion, boarding schools, and a whole range of other assimilative practices. In his classic text, The Invasion Within the Context of Cultures in Colonial North America, historian James Axtell writes, the idea of underwriting an educational institution with a potentially long corporate life appealed greatly to the class of entrepreneurs and gentlemen. They and hundreds of other affluent Englishmen who had never seen an Indian felt comfortable in contributing to schools that promised to solve America's native problem in a relatively inexpensive and appropriately civilized way. The Virginia Company of London and the Massachusetts Bay Company, for example, were global investment corporations expressly in the business of converting savages into civilized persons. They were well attuned to the practices of risk management, and from their vantage point, Indian education posed a much more palatable and lucrative enterprise than others more explicitly violent and militarized. As such, institutions such as Harvard, Dartmouth, William and Mary, Hamilton, and Princeton, among other institutions, were founded on the philanthropic ideations of entrepreneurs and gentlemen looking to turn a profit on the venture of civilizing. Harvard proves to be a case study on this matter. Founded in 1636, the college was established without a single building, teacher, or student until 1638, when John Harvard, a minister of Charleston, died and left his library as well as a significant portion of his estate to the new venture. Even so, the college struggled, continually teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, until Harvard President Henry Dunster drafted the college's Papers of Incorporation in 1650, which, despite no prior commitment to Indian education, included the education of Indian youth as one of its central missions. Dunster's scheme paid in dividends. The addition of the civilizing mission caught the attention of the trustees of the Missionary Fund, which then allocated Harvard the necessary capital to build an Indian college on campus. When plans for the proposed building expanded to twice its original design and 4 times the cost, despite the complete absence of Native students, Harvard's use of the charitable funds aroused suspicion. Once the Indian College was built, however, college officials saw no reason to let it sit vacant and filled its halls with expectant white students. All told, in the nearly 4 decades of its existence, Harvard's Indian College housed only 4 Native students. President Dunster's brazen opportunism and use of the Indian cause to exact English funds for the education of whites established a pattern which others were quick to repeat. Over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, while several colleges and universities received large amounts of money from charitable and mission societies to educate Indian students, very few ever received services. Indeed, in the nearly 200 years following Harvard's founding, only one Native student, Caleb Chishatumak, I think, he's Algonquin, graduated with a degree only to die shortly afterwards from disease. Nationwide, only 52 American Indian students earned college degrees, and fewer than 5 schools offered any earmarked scholarships. It's on the face of this history that we need to understand that it isn't simply that the university is historically white or Eurocentric, but rather that it's successfully carrying out its founding mission of dispossession. This understanding is critical because when you have an institution built on the settler imperative of expansion, there comes a point after the closing of the so-called frontier when the project can only turn on itself, can only cannibalize. This is the frame through which I understand the so-called death of the humanities, the adjunctification of labor, and the devaluing of liberal arts, etc. The refusal to acknowledge and attend to the implications of settler colonialism not only imperils indigenous communities, but also our collective thinking beyond its imperatives. Given this, I think we're obliged to define political projects that aspire beyond the horizons of inclusion, empowerment, and redistribution, because ultimately the dispossessed are not simply victims of the ravages of colonialism, but more importantly, peoples who have chosen to live differently.
Santi, thank you so much. And in for myself, and I think that for many people watching this amazing panel today, it's not night yet. We think that, you know, just like someone said before, there's only one science, the science of history. And that's exactly what we experience today. It's impossible to understand and to change what we are living and what we've been living without understanding the roots, the very deep roots that sustain the colonized university. It's a fact. And we are here to understand and start dissecting with our colleagues that are watching all over the globe, both sides of the pond. So I would indulge myself with some questions, but we've got so many already here in our chat. So I'm going to start with the first one sent by Madeline. So I'm going to read with my very thick Brazilian accent. I'm studying history at university, so obviously I have been exposed to history throughout my education. However, my first serious exposure to colonial history was at university. Do you think that part of combating colonial structures in university would include adding colonial history to secondary or even primary education in order for students to have a better understanding of these issues? So I would like to hear from all the three panelists, and I'm going to start with Lewis Gordon, please.
Well, Madeline, thank you for that question. There are several things that I'd like to say. One thing is, once we have raised the question of decolonization and decoloniality, it means we have to begin thinking outside of the box. So when I say this, I use the word box on purpose, because a lot of us, part of the straitjacket on our thinking is what I call the vessels or box mode of thinking. We tend to treat institutions such as universities or our disciplines as if they've always existed, and as if they're like little boxes that we put things in. So if I begin first, I'm just going to just say some things I'm going to proceed a little in reverse with this. And it connects to what Dr. Tuitt said earlier. You see, once you treat the box as fixed, this is a lot like what we have inherited from. The way I'm using the word liberal here is in a philosophical sense, okay? And what I mean by that is it's something that goes all the way back to the 15th and 16th century, but the basic idea is we have moved away from the community conception and the relationship conception of how we have institutions into the kind of godlike individual boxed or completed notion. And so if we treat history as a discipline as if it's just fixed, then it's a matter of how do you add to it? How do you put things in it? If we treat the university as if it is fixed, then it's a matter of simply adding, say, diversity to it. The problem with that is that it's based on a model that really presumes that there was not something wrong with it structurally, it was just something wrong with its practice. In other words, who was included or excluded. But what we fail to understand is that the kinds of universities we have were not ever independent of the systems around them. So many people, when they fight, for instance, in many countries for independence, the first thing they begin to do is to connect to the rest of the world in their cultural, their culinary, all the other aspects of life. That's why you could have Senegalese jazz, South African hip hop, etc. But what's striking is in the moment of decolonization, of independence, the institutions of power remain the same. It's the same university that was designed for the practice of colonialism that stays intact, the same governing systems such as parliament that remain intact, the same economic system, the same religious systems, etc. So if we come back to the diversity issue, let's pick women as an example. What many people, if you don't plan to change institutions and you just simply put women in, what you're really saying is an institution that was designed for the exclusion of women, that were male institutions, would bring women in as simply males who are anatomically female. In other words, it maintains that structure. And a similar thing happens with race, and a similar thing happens with many other categories. However, if you look at people as relationships, there's no way you could bring a woman into a structure like that without changing the relationship with the structure. And this we're witnessing right now, because what produced women as a subordinated category is linked to a whole lot of other things, ranging from sex to sexuality to class, etc. And so for women to come in, so to speak, one has to transform the very institution itself to address those issues. And this is why we're having many of the struggles we're having in universities today, exactly around issues that connect to women, gender, and sexuality. Well, a similar thing with race, racism, etc. That if we're going to do this, we're going to have to understand that there has been an historical structure of exclusion that goes all the way through to the knowledge levels or the epistemological levels. So to Madeline's question, history would have to change, because a lot of the history that was constructed was a history that was premised upon its legitimacy being marked by the exclusion of something that's fundamental for knowledge, and that thing is called truth. I've often brought up the fact that this is not simply about seeing people who look like us. It's more than that. It's about actually developing a relationship with reality that enables us actually to speak truth. And so if we understand this, it means we have to rethink the idea of what a learning community is. And I had a wonderful experience with this yesterday. I often point out that if we think of learning communities and think in terms of pluriversities instead of universities, then what we understand is that it's a community of people who fell in love with learning and who continue to learn. A professor is a researcher who teaches, but what we are researching is our continued learning. And when we understand this idea about learning communities, it means that many of you who are coming to the university, you're coming to it with unique experiences and different orientation where, although you may not have the accumulation of knowledge of what some of us already have, you're bringing something that we can learn from you. And yesterday I had that experience with a student of mine. I don't think she'll mind me saying her name. Her name is Mandy Long, but basically when I asked her to read something that was written in the 19th century, it's an area of research that led to the very building of sociological knowledge and social theory. And because of the question she was asking about work, she brought in and she saw something that nobody saw before. And she just presumed everybody had to have seen it before. And that's the thing, because you see, her orientation, her experience was so different that the question she brought to it was something profound. And this is what's being what the colonization of knowledge in the university is blocking out. It's blocking out the gift of what most of humanity has to offer for our continued growth. And so for history, there's a book I wrote called Disciplinary Decadence that connects to this issue. What Madeline's question is asking for is what I call a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. And what it means is that we're willing to go beyond our disciplines for the sake of truth. So instead of an add-on of colonial history, the truth is to look at how colonialism functioned in history is to tell the truth about history. In other words, it shouldn't be something that's ghettoized, segregated, or add-on. We now need to have people who are so committed to learning that they're going to challenge themselves and set new conditions for what is to come. And that means not only in education, in history, but in psychology and philosophy and all the disciplines and disciplines to come. The mistake we make is to think that the constellation of knowledge and ways of learning we have now are the only ones possible. But many of you have no idea of the creativity that's in you and what you could bring to enable us to address not only the issues that besiege us today, from fascism all the way through to the question of economic exploitation, but also the very pressing issue of climate change requires thinking completely outside of the framework that's premised upon simply applying a system of knowledge that was already premised upon how to extract and exploit from our tiny speck of dust that we call the planet Earth. So thank you for your question, Madeline, and my colleagues could add to what I just had to say.
Thank you so much, Louis. I would like to invite Cecile to share with us your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Madeline, for your question. My learned colleague, Professor Lewis, has given a profound response to your question. I just want to add a little bit by way of what is currently happening in the UK, specifically in relation to history. In the UK, we are currently marking what we call Black History Month. We are into the 33rd year of marking this event, calendar event in the life of this country. What is Black History Month? Well, Black History Month is an event that, as with all of these things, is a hybrid of a calendar event that was started in the US, and we have adapted it to our particular context. What does this month do in terms of its engagement with matters of history, particularly within the location of the school, not necessarily the university? Is that what it has done, with all good intentions, is to, and not all schools, not all institutions embrace it, but it's an opportunity. It is used to do as, at its best, as Professor has just said, to provide an alternative to the established mainstream knowledge in terms of what Black people's contributions, Black people's situation, but the fact that there are people of African and Caribbean descent in particular in the UK, it is marked to tag on to what is the established desirable knowledge about history. And what happens at its best in a ghettoized way is to raise critique about history. Whose history? And with all good intentions, this has been an opportunity for the community, people from those respective communities, to go into school and try and disrupt the narrative that Black people are victims. Black people have made no contribution of worth to the world. So this has provided a space for the shifting of knowledge, the creation, the production of knowledge to come from bottom up, disrupt the narrative that we have about Black people within Britain, which is very, very negative. So here is a situation, albeit ad hoc, albeit added on. It has provided an opportunity to get the grassroots community to come in and tell their history as they would like it to be told. Now, what is lamentable, although the intentions are good, is this, that back in the 80s, we had what we called multicultural education. And the idea of that was basically to embrace all knowledge, not to prioritize knowledge, but clearly that movement didn't really have any lasting impact, because we are where we are. As you've just said in your question, you asked the pertinent question: why isn't colonial history taught in our mainstream schooling system? And part of that can be linked back to the institutions that creates and perpetuate the ideology of racism and exclusion. The colonial universities.
Thank you so much, Cecile. Thank you very, very much. Sandy, would you like to share your thoughts with us?
Thank you, Maria. I'll be brief. Since my colleagues Louis and Cecile have been so thorough in their remarks, and I support their views of what we call history, and it's not so much about the content or the discipline, but how we're sort of defining that. And I would say, again, sort of to repeat, a decolonial project for me really is fundamentally a material project, right? A material politics that is about land and the return and restore of land to Indigenous peoples. So there's an emerging land back movement here in the US and Canada that really underscores that point, that initially we're talking about a material restoration. I would say beyond that, to understand that land, if we're going to, decolonize a curriculum in a sense, to understand that land is also a relation. It isn't just, the physical thing we're standing upon and knowing the history of whose land we're on, but it requires a whole nother ontology, really, building a little bit about what Louis was saying in terms of finding a different way or recovering or sustaining a different relationship to the world that is beyond productivist logics. So land as a relation really requires a whole nother way of being in the world, of understanding knowledge, of understanding our relations to each other. And so along those lines, I'm a big advocate of what I call emplaced learning, which is, as we're learning and building relations where we are, we need to understand where we are. So many of us, part of the Colonial University is this notion that knowledge is universal and detached and alienated. So you learn math the same way here as you would, in Nottingham, as you would in Iowa, as you would in East Harlem, as you would in Manitoba, Canada, as you would in the Caribbean, as opposed to really thinking about knowledge as fundamentally being informed by where we are. And so many of us go to school, K-12 or university, and learn nothing about where we are. We could be anywhere and take the same courses. And so I think obviously a decolonial notion of history is important, but alongside that, or maybe instead of that, in some ways, I'm a big advocate of emplaced learning.
Right. So, Emily, she asks, I believe that there is a difference between teaching about equity versus teaching with equity, changing educational pedagogies to be more inclusive and collaborative. However, this seems to often be overlooked. How can we encourage professors to change their actual teaching pedagogy instead of solely changing the information they teach? The second question of this block comes all the way from Germany by Wolf Hartline. At my university, we would like to deal with diversity at our university in a large and very mixed group, where not everyone has studied, by reading a book together. Can anyone recommend us a book on this topic? that is not a scientific one. It could even be a novel or play. And just to follow up, Helen McCabe gave a suggestion of a book that is why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, but it would be great to hear from the panelists which are the ones they would recommend. Hopefully some of their own books. And just to make it comprehensive, Zara Ali from our colleague from Connecticut puts here the link with resources. And the third question of this blog by Stephanie Thompson: conscious and unconscious racism is pervasive in the public and private sectors. Could universities take leadership in the development and introduction of continuing professional development, accredited training of its own staff, and thereafter in management in companies and government institutions? Such a training course could include Black history, social societal psychology, and how to achieve structural and behavioral changes in organizations. So we've got a little bit of everything here, from teaching and incorporating equity in the teaching practice, resources to be acquainted with the theme, and then how it would be a course on conscious and unconscious racism. So I'm going to invert a little bit the order now. I'm going to start with Sandy, if it's okay. Sandy.
Okay, I'll start maybe with the pedagogy question, because I think that's really important and something that often I agree with the person who asked, that it's often overlooked. And I think the reason I think pedagogy often gets overlooked, at least in the context of what we now call the US, it became at some point the purview of women. So I think there's sort of an underlying informative sexism around, it's just about the content and like anybody can teach, and that's not something that you have to kind of study or think about. And it's a big topic now in terms of where we are at universities and schools in the middle of the pandemic. I hear a lot of teachers talk about how their students are overwhelmed either from their own illness in their family, or just kind of the news of the day, particularly for BIPOC students. And when there's not an alteration or responsive pedagogy to starting with just checking in and supporting the humanity of our students, you're really not teaching anything other than being dehumanizing. So I absolutely think that we have to be attentive to how we think about learning, kind of the drill and kill and the individuation that happens in a lot of classrooms, and build, going back to, again, what Louis said earlier about learning communities, learning collectives, in which students are able to bring to the conversation their own understandings of what's being learned or studied, and their own gifts that may or may not be around the interpretation of texts, right? So students come to the classroom with all kinds of different gifts, I think, and we often don't learn how to maximize those and support those and value those in the context of the classroom. In terms of, there was another question about what to read, and this will, I'm assuming people will give great book recommendations, so I'll bracket that and just say I would think to listen to anything that invites one to kind of live with a kind of dissonance of your own current understanding, I think is really important. And the way, so to me, for me, a lot of that comes through music, and particularly jazz music. Right now we're really enjoying, oh wow, I'm blanking on his name, the music of Kamasi Washington. And and again, just like listen, but listen very intently. And then I would say also, and this is a much more lifelong commitment, but to really study and learn an Indigenous language. Again, getting back to a place Lewis started us off with, because I don't think you can really understand the impact of epistemicide until you really start to learn at least a few words and concepts in an Indigenous language, and you understand the complete, just how there's very little translation or legibility from that language to a language of a colonizing nation. And so even if it's a word a day, I think it goes quite a long way to start supporting this notion that there's completely different ways of being a conscious human being in the world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's such a holistic answer to these questions. Thank you very much, Sandy. Cecile?
Yes, thank you. I will pick out a few of the themes to complement what has just been said. I see this as interlinking themes. A well-known book here, Why I Stopped Talking, or We Should Stop Talking to White People About Racism, and also the theme of training people to address their racism or unconscious bias, white privilege as such. In relation to this well-known book on this side of the Atlantic, Why I Stopped Talking to White People About Racism, I think as a pedagogist, I don't disagree with not talking. I think we should have and continue to have dialogue, continue to debate. I think that is essential. It is essential for all sorts of reasons. It is essential for sharing and looking at how we can create knowledge that is appropriate and empowering and tackles issues of injustice. So for me, it's not a case of not talking to white people. It's about how you talk to white people and what you say to white people. And by the way, when I talk about white people here as the book, it's not about individuals. It is about structures. So I think that particular proposition is one I could not adhere to, because the issue for me is about power and structure. Whose power, whose structure, who determines them, who runs the power structure, which links into the issue about training those within our universities that run our universities for fiscal reasons and other reasons, for reproducing knowledge that are detrimental to Black people. Many of them who run those institutions, at the top of the institution, decision makers are white. Okay. I don't know whether I could adhere to psychotherapy. I don't know whether we should be subjecting our white colleagues' decision making to psychotherapy to get on their unconscious thinking. That is not the issue. For me, the issue is about getting people in those positions of decision making that are not white. Get those in there that are not white. Have a more reflective, and I don't even like the word diversity. I really don't like that. Diversity and inclusion across the Atlantic, both here and is basically an opportunity, or has been an opportunity, for bringing in a greater proportion of white women in high position. So I'm skeptical about this notion of inclusion and diversity. Let's talk about representation and power. And I don't know whether I cannot subscribe to the psychobabble of putting people on a couch and say, tell me your thoughts, your racist thoughts. If people have racist thoughts and racist practice, well, in this country, we have legislation that is meant to deal with those elements. For me, it is about how you create, how you bring about that transformation in terms of the representation in those institutions. And if we are able to get our institutions to represent our people, represent our society, well, perhaps some of the perpetuation of injustice, marginalization, inclusion, oppression we might be beginning to solve those things. So I focus on the structures, and we should focus on the structures and who actually populate those structures.
Thank you very much, Cecile. Thank you. Very pungent. Lewis, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Sandy and Cecile, for your responses to these questions. What I'd like to add is, first, to Emily, Jane Anna Gordon and I developed in the early 2000s a theory we call the pedagogical imperative. And here's how I usually illustrate it. I was in a debate once with a Black conservative, and the topic was, should we have Black studies? And the Black conservative said, we shouldn't have Black studies because it makes people angry. And my response was, well, what's wrong with that? There are healthy forms of anger. If students are angry when they take a Black studies course, we should ask, what is it they're angry about? Now, it turns out what they're angry about, in my experience, and I know this not only from teaching in Black studies, but also what I taught when I taught, for instance, on African philosophy, contemporary African philosophy, the students noticed something peculiar. Let me just give an example here. If most students go and take a philosophy class, they pretty much presume they're just going to study a group of dead white men. And if they get some women, they're going to be white women. They just presume philosophy is a white enterprise. So when I taught contemporary African philosophy, the students came in and they were studying the works, not only of all these African thinkers, but they also found themselves studying white thinkers, because a lot of the debates contemporary African philosophers are engaged in are global debates. And it turns out in the conversation around Black thinkers, they were able to ask the questions they wanted to ask white thinkers. And it turns out there were a lot of things about philosophy, or you could pick other disciplines, political science, sociology, etc., that were just not being answered when they were presumed generic and complete. So the anger the students had was not simply a question of being angry about the atrocities of history. They were also angry because they came to university or to whatever institution of higher learning they were engaged in because they wanted an education, they wanted to learn. And when their instructors would say stuff like, well, that's not my area, I don't know that, etc., what's striking is they really work hard at trying to learn what white thinkers think, even when it's not in their areas. And what this tells us is that there's a form of epistemic laziness. What the students were saying is, we want to work. And if you're committed to learning about reality around truth, then you should take the time to learn from whomever, right, you can find. In other words, whoever offers something that's valuable, learn from that person. And that we call the pedagogical imperative. The pedagogical imperative is, if you're going to take the time to teach, you better take the time to learn. In other words, all a teacher is a continued learner. And this is what's connected to the earlier remark I made when I talked about my student. Because what it is I'm so overjoyed, not only that I could learn from her, although she came to learn from me, but together we go into a direction to learn more. In other words, research in universities is not simply about what you could check on a line to show how productive you are. It's also a demonstration that you're committed to continued learning and growth. And this connects to what Sandy said, because you see, when Sandy brought up that point about land, I'd like you to really think about it. You see, Euromodern colonialism is invested in the concept of property. And property is an exclusive enterprise. Your property is what you can exclude from others. And when we treat knowledge as property, we build the logic of exclusion from it. We turn it away from the community, relational, shared, human, and perhaps beyond one day, enterprise. And so once we understand that land not simply as something you own or you have, but as something that is nurturing and generating life, then this understanding of the pedagogical imperative is the idea that we're connected to the question of our community's continued growth. To the question from Germany, a short answer, there are many great books, but I got to tell you, when I teach particularly around what I call radical theories of education, I actually include the autobiography of Angela Davis as a book in pedagogy. And the reason is that autobiography is the story of a woman who has to deal with unbelievable odds against her. And in the process, her journey puts her in contexts in which she saw herself as a continued student. Even when she was imprisoned, she began to look at how the prison connects to the models of how we have structured certain forms of miseducation. And as we look through, whether we have certain usual suspects like Antonio Gramsci, but there are other people, a lot of prison intellectuals, a lot of people are incarcerated, indigenous intellectuals, many women who are imprisoned, people all the way through even people such as Rosa Luxemburg. These are people who really think about how to learn under structurally challenging conditions. And they could give insights in how we can build from there. And to Steph Thompson's point, yeah, I totally agree with what was said earlier about the one big error we have had in how we have inherited how to talk about racism is how to avoid talking about it. And part of it is to so over-personalize it that it becomes a kind of individualized therapeutic affair. But I always put it this way, I don't really care that they're racist in the world. I care that they have power. If you can get them off of me, off a lot of us, they can go in their corner and be irrelevant. If we build institutions, we have to remember that racism is fundamentally about power. And if we build institutions that can empower people in a way that they can actually live more fulfilling lives and can grow and are able to exercise citizenship, then all a racist would be is a wacko, a quack, a person who is ultimately irrelevant. The problem is that those wackos, those quacks, have a lot of power over us. So we need political activity. We have to understand that when we're talking about racism, and if we're going to talk about it in terms of education, we're talking about a political issue. So we need to deal with political transformation. And anyway, the last part is I want you to think about the fact that I opened up with talking about questions of humanization. When people are dehumanized, they wither. When people are treated with respect, dignity, when we're connected in terms of humanity, we grow. And this is crucial because a lot of education, educata, is about growth. It's about to bring forth flourishing, to enable us to grow. But one of the ways we grow is to be able to learn how to deal with the unfamiliar, to deal with the challenging. And this point that Sandy said about translation is very crucial because imperial understandings of translation treats one's knowledge system as if it's complete and you have to squeeze everybody into it. If you understand that your knowledge system doesn't have the answers to everything, then what you understand is that there are others from whom and with whom you can learn. And you learn not through translating them into your system, but actually through understanding that when your system is exhausted, you learn others. And this is one of the capacities we have for growth. Because one of the things, when I was speaking with another student yesterday, his name is Darian Spearman, one of the things that was interesting is he began to understand, because I spent time studying ancient languages and other languages, how different it is to have a conversation about the world when you have it in Medonetter, when you understand, for instance, among the UConn, what Sunsum is, when you understand how people talk about life in ways that could be illuminating and creatively different ways of seeing the universe. So the answer is really learn. Go beyond that comfort zone and get into the world of understanding that you can always learn something from your fellow humanity and also beyond humanity from what the world around us, including the world of nature, is trying to say to us as living creatures are also suffering right now from the degradation of this planet conducted by imperial regimes.
Can I just say one thing? The question, can you recommend a book? A book that was written in 1982 that started me on the road to sociology. I'm a sociologist. The Empire Strikes Back, Race and Racism in the 70s in Britain, edited by the late Stuart Hall. I think to a degree we are building on many of the discussions and debates going back those many years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecile, Lewis, Sandy. It's really, it makes us reflect that we need to go about beyond ourselves and also beyond individuals, isn't it? It's to think about the ideas that brought us here. It's not individualized. It's not, we try to epitomize, we tend to epitomize ideas and concepts into people, but it's not the case. And thank you for all of you for making it clear, and and this constant challenge, cultural, philosophy, the challenge, the epistemology that is that currently prevails. So thank you so much. Now it's time for a challenge for the three of you, okay? Because we don't have a lot of time and there are some amazing questions, and I'm going to challenge our colleagues that are not visible here, Zara and Malika, that are the driving force behind this event happening from Connecticut and Nottingham, to maybe we can try to keep a live platform with these questions and with discussions that will last for some time after the event. So I'm going to read 3 questions, and if possible, your final remarks encompassing them. Okay, let's see if it works. So the first one, unfortunately, the person didn't leave the name. How do we get universities in the UK to understand the link between these, I believe, that what we're discussing today, the university being colonial, and the BAME attainment gap? Margaret Rebecca asks, what is the role of tenure in maintaining colonial power structures in the university? And how might tenure be usefully reformed? And Peter Zarrow from Connecticut, can the panelists say a little more about the university as institution, but about the nature of modern Western knowledge today as colonial, perhaps along the lines of Said's notion of Orientalism as alive and well? So I think that the theme here is the university and how to reform it, I would say. So I'm going to start now with Cecile, if it's okay. Or you want to give to, is it all right? Start with you?
That's fine.
Okay.
The 3 question, I'll focus, I'll try and focus on 3, but I wanted to come in on the question about the attainment gap within our universities with respect to those that are not white primarily, and the whole debate around attainment gap, that is Black students, for want of a better word, not realising their potential and coming out with degrees that do not reflect their potential as such, so lower class degrees. And I know this debate about the attainment gap is also something that is a live debate in the US. I and some of the colleagues, my colleagues in the US, have written extensively on this issue of Black students not realising their potential, to the extent that, interestingly enough, a book that I co-authored came out last week, looking at this very same issues, focusing on young Black men, because young Black men also disproportionately underperform. Now, this whole issue of the underperformance of Black students is something that is a problem for the entire education system, certainly in the UK. Black children enter the formative years of their schooling up to the age of 11. In many instances, do well or perform better than most other groups. And as they progress through the education system, all the way up to university, you see their performance, they underperform. So this is an issue in terms of the attainment gap that is not just about university. The university system perpetuates that system. So the underperformance in the education system for Black students is endemic, systemic, and institutionalized. And I think we need to recognize that. Well, why? Well, the factors, the processes are the same as there are in schools. The processes are around expectations, lack of support, the fact of microaggression that Black students experience, how the teaching, the pedagogical approach that they encounter, particularly as they progress through the education system. So if we can solve what goes on in higher education, university sector, we can also solve what goes on further down in the education system. Well,
thank you so much, Cecile. And you are just in time, because I forgot to say, but you felt it.
So
Perfect. 3 minutes, yeah, but so yeah, please finish.
So for summing up, going back to my opening remarks, I see this as the need to tackle structural issues, tackle white privilege, tackle structural, systemic, institutionalized colonialism and racism that is embedded within our Eurocentric universities.
Thank you so much, Cecile. And I didn't realize I was, cutting you. And thank you very much for wrapping up beautifully. Sandy?
Thank you, Maria. I guess I'll just sort of share a question I have that the questions themselves raise. And I guess, what does it, if we're presuming, as we all seem to be, that the university is fundamentally and perhaps irreformably colonialist, and therefore enacting various forms of colonial violence, what does it mean to then have a desire that we achieve within that? What's the cost of our success? And should that be the desire? And so I think when I think about curriculum or achievement gaps or tenure, all of those are evaluative systems set up in ways that are fundamentally oppressive. So I don't know personally that that's the focus of my intervention. I think at my age and experience thus far, I'm much more committed to projects outside of the university. A book that I would recommend, going back to an early question, would be the Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's The Undercommons, among others. But I like when they talk about the task as being in but not of the university. So we're all in the university right now, clearly. But I don't think but I like the way that they cast that we don't necessarily have to be of that. And I read that as a call, in a sense, to place my labor and efforts elsewhere. So one aspect of my work continues with the Defenders of the Water School that started at the Standing Rock standoff and continues on. And those are the kinds of projects that I feel where I dedicate, my time and labor and the focus of my creative energies to imagine a different way of thinking about knowledge and knowledge production. And I guess I'll just end there.
Thank you so much, Santi. And it's interesting that you bring this element of the creativity, isn't it? We need to be creative, particularly because it's to understand a world that does not exist. So we are creating our reality, and it demands this finding creativity within. And once again, last but not least, Luis.
Thank you, Maria, and thanks all of you who asked the questions. That point you just made about creativity really hit to the fore for me, because my greatest teachers, I grew up with Rastafarian uncles, jazz musicians, and my mentor for my doctorate was a man who grew up in Yiddish theater. So the world of creativity is a crucial part of how I look at learning communities. I'm going to just make some very brief points because we're short on time. The first thing is we have to think relationally. One big error is that too many of us, many universities have imagined that they were somehow independent of the structural of the systems around them. If you take the South African university as an example, many of them imagined that they were independent of apartheid, when in fact apartheid in South Africa needed the universities to be able to develop the system of not only colonial epistemic practices, but also the technologies of how to create that pernicious system of dehumanization and exclusion. The same thing in the United States. The United States basically has a long history, as Sandy pointed out very well in her story of Harvard, of how the very mechanisms were intimately connected to the social structure. So the first thing is to get rid of this ridiculous idea that a university is on a special place on a hill that's completely separate from the institutions of power, and also the institutions, and also the positive institutions in the sense of empowerment that are around us. So we don't want to be reductive about the university, but we need to take very seriously that some of the processes of exclusion were by design. The second thing that we need to talk about is what it means to become a problem. And some of the questions that were asked about were connected to problems of measurement. The short version of this was really observed very well by W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois observed the problem of having institutions that make people into problems instead of addressing the problems people face. We need to rethink our very systems of measurement, because they were actually designed in such a way to make certain categories of people subordinated and fail. What we need to understand is that we have to understand what the needs of the communities are, and to find a way to address the problems they face instead of making them into a problem, because the persistent language about underperformance of Blacks, etc., ultimately are coded versions of saying that Black people have a problem. If they don't fit, there's something wrong with Black people. When in fact, this is exactly what, if we think about what Dalits argue in India, that the very system of assimilation is premised upon their exclusion. In other words, they're paradoxically assimilated through not fitting. So we need to actually have a completely different understanding of measurement. And I have to be frank, I'm one of those people who actually don't even believe in grading. I find it very pernicious, but that's a whole other debate, and it'll take up too much time. The last part, the last two parts very quickly, is that one issue we have to take very seriously is mentoring. When we have this model of the isolated individual who just learns because she or he is so brilliant, it's a complete lie. Every study I've made of people who have excelled, every single example was of an individual who was mentored. And in racist environments, in sexist environments, those are blockages to proper mentoring that people need. So we need to understand that there's no one of great repute who was not able to excel from a community that was nurturing her or him. And so this is a model that we need to rethink and bring into how we think pedagogically and institutionally. The last two are double consciousness versus potentiated double consciousness. We're having a conversation about double consciousness at the moment, which is the structured exclusion of people. But potentiated double consciousness is what Du Bois and many others brought up, where we need to deal with the contradictions. In other words, we need to address the society that makes people into problems rather than accept the idea of in a permanent way that we are problems. And this means then that we have to think dialectically. We need to be able, that means that we have to be able to take hold of how we can transform the institutions. And this potentiated double consciousness leads to the last part, which is we need to understand that human institutions are what we make them. And even though it's not about whether we can do it overnight, we need to set the foundations to start developing new relationships for communities whom we may never meet. But if we do our work, well, those communities will appreciate our efforts. So it means ultimately, and this is something that one of my students, Patricia Rourke, talks about in her research, we really need to understand the important political force of radical love. And I don't mean it as a mushy way. The narcissistic way is the colonial way, which is to create institutions that reproduce people into imitations. But we need to create institutions that enable people to grow and actually excel and exemplify something that's radically different from what we are, but ultimately is something through which that radical difference is what enables them to grow. And that is what radical love is, and that is what political commitment is, and that is ultimately what the praxis of trying to build an alternative, in other words, what decolonizing the university is for, that is the project we all now face.
I am so, so grateful to all of you for these very deep reflections and for sharing your knowledge, your creativity with all of us. And to wrap up this moment, I'm going to invite our Pro-Vice Chancellor for Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion and People here at the University of Nottingham, Professor Sarah Sharples, for the closing remarks to this inspiring event. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria, for a brilliant job chairing. Thank you to all of our speakers for hugely insightful and thought-provoking and challenging comments that I've taken an awful lot from. I'm really proud of the university's commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion, and I think events like this are incredibly important to help us to shift the dial in our progress. But I do leave this session thinking that I agree with you in that the answer to the question, is the university colonial? Well, yes, because our history will always state and will always give evidence to the colonial basis on which our institutions are founded. My job's about what we do next, and I think it's worth just sharing a few thoughts that I've taken from all of you today, actually, about what we do next. So I think events like this are really important in terms of recognition, listening, honesty, energy, action, and change. But I think it was Cecile that said that any of our current actions do not absolve our responsibility for past injustice. And I think that it's really important, particularly that people in roles like mine don't think, oh, that's good, we fixed it. We can't fix history. We need to recognise, embrace, understand, and learn from history. And I think that's a very difficult but really important thing for us to do. We also, I think, need to learn to live with dissonance and learn to live with the dissonance of our own current understanding. And I think, Sandy, this was something that you sort of worked on, but others sort of talked about. And learning to deal with unfamiliar and uncomfortable notions, I think, is something that all of us need to sort of work through. But I think it's worth thinking about what the university is. We've talked a lot about colonialism, but what's the university? Well, for me, the university is our people, and people who learn and continue to learn. That's why I stay in a university and don't look for a job elsewhere, because I want to continue to learn, and I thrive in an environment where we all continue to learn. And we need to combine that learning with treating each other with humanity, because if we sustain the systemic bias, the systemic racism within our institutions that reflects the systemic racism within society, then we're missing out on opportunities for novel insights, as you so eloquently mentioned, Lewis, as well. So I'm going to remind us, I think, to end of the phrase that I wrote down, and I bet I don't pronounce it right, the panepistimoire, the community of knowledge coming together, which I think is what we need to all work on to try and overcome the challenges that the Colonial University presents to all of us, and particularly represents to those groups that are underrepresented in leadership, in senior management, and in the material that we expose each other to. So I'd just like to reiterate my thanks to all of you. Thanks to all the people who've worked in the background to make today's event happen. Thanks to all those who have published a huge number of questions. And I know there's going to be some work in the background to make sure we can give you all answers to these questions as well, because we really value the effort that's been put into those. So there's going to be some work that will make sure that we try and find a way to share the panel's views on the answers to some of the really, really helpful questions that you raised. This is the first of 3 events, so there will be 2 more events on the 30th of November and the 15th of February. And I think what I hope that you've all taken, as I have today, is how valuable it is having the diverse perspectives from our 2 institutions, as well as the many institutions represented by those attending here as well. Because if we are going to change the systemic bias and the impact of colonialism within our higher education systems, then we need to work together, we need to support each other to make those changes. And I'm hugely, hugely grateful for the input from tonight's event. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.